Hi, everyone. Welcome this afternoon. I'm Joanne Camiff Ward, and for those of you who I don't know, I direct the Human Rights in the U.S. project at the Columbia Law School Human Rights Institute, and I'm really thrilled and honored to be here with you today and to introduce and moderate this conversation about what a Biden-Harris administration human rights agenda really must look like if we're serious about putting the principles of human dignity, equality, and justice into practice. I think we're at a new moment in the US human rights movement, and we've emerged from a presidential administration that really rolled back human rights protections along every conceivable marker I can think of, certainly at home, and attempted really to do so globally as well, with greater success in some areas than others. And I think many of the human rights advocates I work with have been in a deep defensive mode over the past 4 years, really thinking about how to stop harms and not even having the bandwidth to be more proactive at most points about how to redress harms that already existed and also have a more affirmative agenda. And I think part of this new moment, too, has been the renewed public reckoning, really, with the ways that domestic laws, policies, and institutions have perpetuated inequality, either by design or by default. This reckoning was in some ways forced by the ongoing devastation of the coronavirus and really its disproportionate impact on Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and poor white communities, as well as what we've seen over the last year in the form of protests in support of Black lives, both where I live in New York, around the country, and in other countries as well. Today, we're facing the consequences really of national policies that do not recognize economic and social rights, a fundamental part of human rights, and that really have only partially ever protected civil and political rights, largely based on who you are. That said, I think we're in a moment of optimism. I say cautious optimism because I'm an attorney, but it's really an opportunity for change in governance because the calls to address drivers of inequality and injustice are at a high point. That optimism, though, is tempered by the deep divisions that we see along economic lines, racial lines, lines of political ideology, and deep disagreement really about the role of government and who it should be accountable to, as well as persistent threats to rule of law and democracy. And we could have a whole session just on what those are. But at the same time, I think we see these national and international crises and discussions and reckoning happening within the human rights movement, within many of the organizations who are here today and in the domestic human rights field. We're wrestling with how our own identities inform the work we're doing and how we individually remain accountable to human rights principles that we espouse. And so these are some of the issues that we're going to begin to tackle in our time today. Maybe we'll solve parts of some of them, or at least have new ideas for how to solve parts of them. And I'm really elated that the Institute is joined by such a distinguished group of discussants who've been thinking through how to advance civil and human rights for their entire careers and really approaching this work critically and passionately. I'm going to introduce them in speaking order and just name their roles, because if I start to give accolades or personal anecdotes or talk about the impacts they've had, that would also take up the whole hour. But it's my personal and professional pleasure to welcome Vince Warren, the Executive Director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, Nahal Zamani, Director of Movement Building at Demos, Mara Verheyden-Hilliard, the co-founder of the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund, and Nadia Ben Youssef, Advocacy Director for the Center for Constitutional Rights. And just to kind of give a roadmap of where we're going to go today, we're going to kick it off with some remarks from Vince, whose organization, CCR, released a rights-based vision for the first 100 days, which we can share later on in the program. And then we're going to talk, the remaining panelists and I are going to talk through human rights priorities that we're focused on in our organizations, and some of the opportunities and barriers in the pathway to achieving those priorities. We'll have a joint discussion, and we will also have time towards the end where you can put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll respond to those either through the program or in the last few minutes. So thank you again so much. And Vince, we'll start with you. It would be excellent just if you could situate our conversation by talking a little bit about the principles that define CCR's priorities and how you're working to ensure that this is indeed a moment of transformation rather than a return to what was never wonderful status quo.
Thank you, Joanne. It's wonderful to be with everybody. And thank you for giving me the opportunity just to speak briefly to frame what's going to be a really, really great discussion. And I wanted to start off exactly with that question is, what does the promise of transformation actually look like? How should we be thinking about it? And I would start off by saying that, we are in a point, as you pointed out, where we have a tremendous opportunity to undo a lot of the really horrible damage that's been done over the last 4 years. And the 4-year framework, I think, is a very key way for us to think about, actionably in terms of progress. What progress will we be making over the next 4 years that we lost over the last 4 years? But the promise of transformation, particularly if we're going to be thinking about the state of white supremacy that we live in this country, that the transformation shouldn't just be measured against 4 years. It should be measured against 400 years. And for those of us who are policy advocates, and for those of us who operate within these systems, that seems like a very large framework for us to be thinking about rather than something that's clearer at 4 years. But let me just make the case as to why that should be. I think many of us were quite heartened to hear the Biden-Harris team calling for unity for us to solve America's problems. I mean, Lord knows we haven't had that for a while. We certainly haven't had it for the last 4 years. And I think it's a very powerful message. But if we unpack that message, what we see is that the calls for unity to solve America's problems is essentially a call to solve America's problems, which will be to the benefit of Black folks. And that's going to lead us back to the status quo ante. If we're lucky, we'll get back to where we were 4 years ago. And at Center for Constitutional Rights, we've been thinking about what's the vision for change? What does transformation look like? And we have been centering Blackness in our advocacy, in our programmatic work, in our discussions. And so the challenge for us, that I see is that the question is not how do we solve America's problems that will benefit Black people, but what we should be doing is talking about solving Black people's problems, the problems that Black people navigate, which will solve the problems that America has never faced up to. And that's a very different framing. The law enforcement values that we have in this country, and that even the Democrats embrace, inevitably lead us back to the defensive battle that we've been fighting over the centuries. So when Black people were emancipated from servitude, what did we litigate and advocate around? Fugitive laws and property rights. When Black people protested in the 1960s, we litigated breach of the peace charges. When Black Panthers called on revolutionary change, we litigated criminal conspiracy charges. When Black Lives Matter called for transformational changes, we litigate and currently litigating Black identity extremist designations. And what does that tell you? That tells us two things. Number one, that the law enforcement reflex, the punitive reflex in this country, the criminalization that is attendant to the definition of Blackness is so powerful that it even has those of us that are on the cutting edge of building something new on the defensive around the question of criminalization. And that's something that we're going to have to change, and we're going to have to change it in a bold way. If the past is going to be the past, or the past is the past, then the future has to be something different. So what does that look like? The solution is in our advocacy that we have to move from the question of timidity to temerity. And what I mean by that is, you all know, and you're all feeling it, is that we operate on fiscal years and we operate on election cycles, and we're trying to figure out what's the stuff that we can get in now that is doable. And the problem is that in our bicameral context, in the sort of the broad democratic values that we have in this society that have never worked for Black people, that if we are advocating for what is doable, then we are essentially throwing our lot in to the status quo. And so that's why the 400-year aspect, I think, is important. And so if we were to throw ourselves into a time machine into two different places, and imagining that we were coming up with a strategy during apartheid South Africa around the question of pass laws, or if we were back in the United States and we were and we wanted to end slavery, what would the advocacy strategies that we would be pushing forward? Would we be pushing forward, or should we be pushing forward the idea that incremental change is important, or should we be pushing forward the idea of concrete changes within the framework of what transformation looks like? And I think it's the latter. We need to be thinking about what we can do now that is going to set the stage for the conversation that we haven't had. Lastly, I wanted to maybe just talk a little bit about the difference between optimism and hope. And Joanne, I think you're right. We're all in the space of optimism in the context of thinking about this current administration. But there's a difference between optimism and hope. And I would say that optimism is the realm of people that have power, and hope is the realm of people that seek power. And what I mean by that is, if you imagine yourself on an interstate, the middle of the night, your car has just broken down and you're on the side of the road, and you call for help. And in your rearview mirror, you see a police car pulling up and there's nobody around. You see the flashing lights. The difference between optimism and hope is that most white people would feel optimistic that they're going to have their problem solved. Based on their history, based upon what they know, their likelihood is that they're going to be on their way. For most Black people, that's not optimism. What you're thinking about is that you hope that the situation will turn out in a way that solves your problem, as opposed to creating a different problem for you. And for us as advocates, it's important for us to be in the realm of hope, which requires us not to think so much about what is possible in this moment, but what is necessary in the trajectory that we're on. We want to be on the side of pushing forward clear, actionable solutions that transform the relationship with this country and Black people, and not pushing forward advocacy concepts that further segment and redefine what is fair for Black people as what is fair for America. I'm super excited that our panelists are going to be addressing some of these broader issues. And I think that at the end of the day, the power that we should be wielding is the power of hope. That is, that we push for what our people need and not just what's possible.
Thank you so much, Vince. And keeping the eye on the prize, and picking up on that last point really about what is needed and the framework of equity, right? We have over and over seen the US fall back on a civil rights frame of equal access, equality, in ways that have not reckoned with the past that you are talking about. And there's a real need, if we're to move ahead, that we reckon with that and think about how do we design policy that really reflects that need. So really appreciate it. And now we're gonna turn to some of the questions of what are the actionable policy changes that we can move towards? Because even within this 400-year framework that Vince laid out, right, CCR has an 100-day plan. And it's not necessarily that you're going to accomplish those things in 100 days, but that for each of these long-standing transformative goals, there are things that can change in the moment. And so how do we, in this space, think about our role as lawyers in laying the groundwork for transformative change, rather than maybe setting our sights on the incremental or focusing only on what is doable or achievable in the short term. And you spoke about it, Vincent, talking about the legislative process and timelines and grants and funding, right? We see things in short frames as kind of a necessary for human survival, but also our work has often been thought about that way. And so that needs to change as well. And that is also kind of a luxury of being a lawyer, that you can think in those different spaces of time rather than what indeed is necessary. So I want to kick it over now first to Mara to talk a little bit about how you are approaching this moment of hope and thinking about what are changes that are necessary to make under this administration to better protect and foster civil and human rights.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for organizing this event, and I'm very glad to be here. Well, at the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund, we do constitutional rights litigation. I have been a litigator for more than 20 years, 25 years, actually graduated from Columbia Law. And, and when we look at the situation that we're in right now, operating from, what Vince was talking about, the issues of optimism and hope. And in my view, that the issue of optimism has to do with practical realities. Like what do we have at hand? What are we facing? What are the circumstances that we can concretely look at that provide us a basis for forward movement? And for us, that involves both the people that make the historical process, which is the people themselves, and the actions of the people and the movement of the people, which really are the driving force in the historical process towards liberation throughout history. And then when we look at the Biden-Harris administration and what opportunities exist and what challenges we are facing, they are substantial. And those challenges that we believe must be addressed head-on include the extraordinary threats right now to fundamental First Amendment rights, to organizing, to the ability of people to be in the streets. We are seeing across the country, over the last several years, there have been dozens of new anti-protest laws that have been enacted on a state legislative level. And just in the last few weeks, dozens more, every single business day, are being introduced by state legislatures. And what's significant about this is that much of this in the last few weeks is being driven by the violent attack by the white supremacist mob at the Capitol, and an extraordinary act of hypocrisy and cynicism. We are seeing the right-wing state legislatures actually using the violent attack of white supremacists to push forward policies and laws that will completely work to suppress the racial justice movement, the social justice movement, the environmental justice movement. These include critical infrastructure laws and other so-called critical infrastructure laws and other laws that are targeted directly at people that are demonstrating against pipelines, people that are demonstrating for racial justice in the street. They include provisions that limit liability for drivers that drive into demonstrations in the street. They include enhanced penalties for classic nonviolent civil disobedience or trespassing that would amp these up to heavy-duty felonies and fines. They include private rights of actions against demonstrators. They include basically codifying the privatization of our public police forces as private security for industry. It's a breadth that is astonishing. And we think, even though these are state legislative issues, that this administration has an obligation to affirmatively and absolutely take concrete steps on a federal level to affirm First Amendment rights, not creating a new grant of First Amendment rights, because we're not suggesting in any way that there's some law that needs to expand the rights. It's an affirmation of rights and a restriction on illegal police conduct. That includes a federal effort to eliminate qualified immunity of police officers. It includes restrictions on illegal police conduct. But right now, in the wake of January 6th, this administration is signaling as well that it would support a domestic terrorism law, which would be extraordinarily damaging. I mean, all you have to do is think about what that law would have looked like in the hands of the last administration to know that you can't have something like that on the books. There are enough criminal laws, more than enough criminal laws, that exist to address anything that happened at the Capitol. But what's happening is that there is an inadequacy of investigation and an inadequacy of prosecution with regard to the white supremacists, and certainly as compared to our clients, racial justice activists, Black demonstrators who are routinely attacked, mass arrested, kettled, pepper sprayed, subject to chemical weapons, to beatings. You know, it's a level of disparity that is so overt. So these are, to speak briefly, some of the areas that we think are crucial. And then the other area, of course, is the issue of environmental justice. And this administration, although it's created the climate czar and has John Kerry and has elevated this to a national security position, the fact is that the military itself has said that the climate crisis is perhaps the most significant threat that's facing national security. And yet that can easily become a pretext for more funding for the military when the military is among, if not the greatest polluter on a global scale. So the worry that we have is the issue of the status quo. I mean, for example, John Kerry previously had supported the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have allowed private corporations to sue sovereign states for loss of profits, which would include if a country enacted its own environmental protection laws. We can't accept the status quo and we can't return to it. If we are going to move forward, environmental justice has to include keeping the fossil fuels in the ground, not trying to simply create a market for export in other countries while maybe doing work domestically. It has to include clean water. It has to include environmental and racial justice, because you can't have environmental protections without there being safety and protection for all people. These things are completely entwined and interrelated, and these are essential if we are going to change where we are and if we are not going to face extinction.
Thank you so much, Mara. I mean, you picked up on some of the really important themes that kind of Vince foreshadowed around the pretty uniquely American turn to criminalization in almost all contexts as a way to address not even the social problems, but the way those social problems manifest in public protest. And this is obviously not started with the last administration or at the federal level. It has been a problem at the state level for quite a long time. But the turn now to think about climate as a security issue and what that can mean both domestically and globally. And I think you touched on these last issues are not things the United States is going to solve alone, even if we are one of the greater contributors to climate change. So thinking not only what needs to happen at the domestic level, and you noted some kind of key actions the administration could take, but also in partnerships globally. And so picking up on some of the threads of the kind of disproportionate impact of the laws that you're talking about emerging at the state and local level, I wanted to turn to Nahal, who's with Demos, to speak a little bit about kind of how you are approaching the administration's commitment to racial equity and racial justice, and what does that look like really in policy change?
It's a great question, and I'm so delighted to be here with all of you and be learning so much from co-panelists, and so appreciative of Vince for setting us off with a true commitment, I think, that we all share towards an affirmative vision of equity and justice. So I'm at Demos. We're a national think tank. We really work on and fight for long-term structural democracy reforms. We also are pushing for a just recovery and a just and equitable economic recovery, which is something that's very top of mind to most of us here right now. And we also work with grassroots Black and Brown led organizers on the ground that are building power in their communities amid everything, and really truly winning in remarkable ways. So for us, we had a number of priorities going into the Biden-Harris administration. In December, we had a couple of policy briefs that we put out, and we were really trying to tackle large issues, really thinking of what are the structural changes that we need by a bold and unapologetic administration. So in one area, we were thinking about like, what are the crucial areas of democracy reform that are needed right now? And we named a number of executive actions. They included having Biden designate federal agencies to provide voter registration, because we think that this is a really crucial issue that's been made very poignant over the last few years, to strengthening the Department of Justice and how it actually enforces voting rights statutes, to even thinking about what an office of democracy could look like in the White House that could really like coordinate a number of efforts. We have a second brief that looks at economic and just recovery. And we there are thinking about like crucial ways of how do we build long-term power for Black and Brown communities, right? What does it look like to have a reinvestment in public goods, public infrastructure, to think about the equitable distribution of resources, to think about workers' rights, which have been made all the more precarious by the pandemic and all the vulnerabilities that have been exposed. And lastly, we're part of a larger racial equity collaborative, and we wrote to Biden's transition and asked for a White House Office of Racial Equity and Inclusion. And the idea was we should have a bold infrastructure that's set up, even if transitions happen and administrations change, that is truly like having a robust cross-agency strategy for advancing racial equity. So it's not just something you say, which is still amazing in an inaugural speech, but it's a series of coordinated actions to model best practices at the state level, but also have an affirmative vision of what the federal government should be doing. So these are a couple of the things that we've been thinking about in our larger attempt to get at some of the structural changes that are needed, given how much systemic racism is seeped into every aspect of people's lives.
Thanks so much. And I think, you know, in that, and we were talking about this before we started, right? There's a focus on process and decision making, because those are actually, you know, those are the most identifiable doors that have been shut to the folks that you're talking about building power with, right? I mean, even yes. So thinking about process, but really to get to different outcomes. And this goes to the type of laws that Mara was talking about emerging on the state level. So I'm hoping maybe after we hear from Nadia, we can talk a little bit about how you're framing these asks in this time. You know, one of the questions that we were talking about is, what are the barriers to moving forward these really bold new agendas, and ensuring that our work is inclusive, and that we're forwarding these values at a time when there's really great division. But before we get to the barriers, we're still on what are we prioritizing, and how do we have a bold vision. And so Nadia, I wanted to turn it over to you to talk maybe just a little bit about the approach to the rights-based vision that CCR put forward, how you're thinking about dismantling structural racism in the work you're doing, and to inform the outcomes.
Thanks, Joanne, and thanks to the co-panelists, echoing Nahal that I'm taking notes from you and learning. So grateful to the folks who are in the Q&A kind of pushing the discussion, because I think this is a conversation, this is a community that we're building. So you know, it's this question in terms of our priorities kind of goes back to what Vince laid out at the beginning, and why CCR and why movement engages in this sort of policy work. engages in systems of oppression at all. Systems of oppression upheld by institutions in our government. When we'll get to the barriers, but it's hard not to say, our kind of analysis of what this system is one that upholds racial capitalism, one that upholds the lie of the hierarchy of human life. And so we approach the government and we approach the state from a position of critique and an awareness of kind of the 400 years of colonialism and white supremacy that is being upheld by our government of 2021, by the global world order of which the United States plays a dominating and oppressive force. So why we're putting out kind of a 100-day agenda is in part to have a public conversation about power. It's not because we're anticipating that this administration, a neoliberal administration, that certainly is a departure from the neo-fascist, proto-fascist administration that we've just experienced and that you spoke about at the beginning, Joanne. But why do we engage at all, right? And I think it goes into larger advocacy strategies, and both Mara and Nahal spoke about the primary advocacy strategy that we know is that mass movements with a vision win every time, that we have to build power, that's actually, if we're going to talk about building power and we're going to prioritize transformation, our target is not Biden. Our target is not the 117th Congress. We don't believe that these forces and these institutions will save us. We know that our people will save us. And so why we engage is really to have a public conversation about power, to at times disrupt power, right? So this is about accountability. This is about mitigating harm, why we might approach, and why some of our 100 days agendas are about that, disrupting power, mitigating the harm on our communities. And then, finally, what we might engage in systems of oppression is to redistribute power. And that's, I think, if I were to say, what is one thing that we're asking of this administration that kind of encompasses the 100 days demands, which I can run through, but I'm happy also just to put them in the chat for folks so we can have time for question. But is the recalibration of national priorities, is the redistribution of wealth. We've seen that we have the capacity to leverage mass public wealth. Often that's in the case of protecting corporations and corporate interests in times of economic recessions. So we've seen leveraging of mass public wealth. We also saw it in this sort of the recovery that Nahal was talking about, these sort of stimulus packages, though in those, of course, you saw that profits still trumped people because we're in the reality that we're in, but nonetheless, there is mass wealth, our public wealth, the people's wealth that can be redistributed. So if we can rethink, and this is kind of building on what you laid out, Joanne, the moment of transformation that we're in, where we take the leadership of movement and impacted people, those who feel in their bones what the system and structures of oppression are telling us recalibration means defunding the police and investing in our communities. And so if we take that to a higher level, it also means defunding our military. It's about recalibrating our national priorities to address, issues of, Mara, you ended your remarks like around extinction and environmental racism and the climate crisis, and investing resources there, investing resources in community safety, in health infrastructure, in education, what actually keeps us safe. And then certainly to go back to the main point of redistributing our resources to address historical injustice. So this is about reparations. This is about Indigenous sovereignty. This is about really looking at the root cause of the structures and systems we have in place right now and building power towards that fundamental change. So I think at the top level, we aren't expecting much, but we are demanding what is necessary. I think the 100 days it's called the rights-based vision for the first 100 days. And our whole idea is that we're demanding what is necessary. for repair, for safety, for collective liberation, and not what we think is possible. This goes back to Vince's point, right? And I think we can lay out, steps that both the executive can do to, institute an equitable COVID response, to invest in safe communities, to, we can say it, and there are easy things to do. What we're interested in is how we build power towards the transformational moment and to kind of really step into that. Awesome.
Thank you so much. And I think, the idea of redistribution of wealth and of prioritizing economic investments in communities that have long been starved of resources, really on purpose, is a major strategy, right? And that involves changing who is part of the discussion of what policies look like. So I would love to get your thoughts on really how practically the work that you're doing as lawyers really is seeking to build power in communities that not only have sometimes been excluded from decision-making, particularly at the federal level, but who have seen that it's not a good use of time necessarily, right? Are rejecting that framework as kind of, as Nadia said, like, okay, the government's working as it's supposed to work. It was not built to meet my community's needs. So how are you approaching that? And maybe Mara, from you, how are you thinking about that as you approach litigation or work in conjunction, maybe not in the litigation context, but on some of the other issues you mentioned, which are kind of environmental justice, clean water, and other pieces?
Well, that framework is the foundational measure of and mission of our work. All of our work is focused in this arena on the understanding that it is the people themselves that make change, and that when it comes to doing constitutional rights litigation, our litigation focuses on making sure that the spaces are available for people to come together, that we are protecting and defending people who are prosecuted, targeted for their political organizing activities. We do civil rights, constitutional rights, police misconduct litigation, recognizing the oppression of occupied communities and trying to tactically seek measures and equitable relief. All of our work is impact litigation with those larger goals in mind. And all of our work is done in partnership with the affected communities, with people on the ground who are the most oppressed, who are subject to the abuses or actually just the systematic nature of how our state operates. And I think that also, like when, for example, just over the past week, we've been working in partnership with Indigenous frontline activists who are trying to stop in opposition to the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline that is destroying Indigenous lands and water in northern Minnesota. And, taking back to this issue that we started with, that Vince was talking about unity, this is something that we see around the country. Like when we talk about unity, I think it's very different than when the Biden administration or others talk about unity. We do not see that there is unity that's going to happen with white supremacists. And we don't think trying to have unity with white supremacists on a basis of an extreme fascist, reactionary, racist position is useful. We do think that trying to reach people who maybe don't have exposure, don't have experience, but actually share common cause and common issues is true unity. So for example, we see where there's unity between Indigenous frontline activists and other folks in a community who maybe traditionally wouldn't have been thinking in that way, but recognize the devastation of their lands, of their farmlands, or even their vacation homes. But the recognition that there's ways to build unity. And that's true when it comes to the issue of people who are dispossessed by the economic system of the United States, where there is, mass suffering The billionaires have become multi-billionaires over this past year of a pandemic, while working people are struggling or suffering or out of healthcare because our healthcare system is tied to employment, where people don't have enough to eat, where there's massive food lines. There's every reason to build that kind of unity and that kind of power to create absolute meaningful change. And so our focus is always on that type of unity and on litigation that opens the space up, that allows people to organize, that stops the government's attacks against the movement, because we know that that is the road to change.
Thank you so much, and for the work too, right? Not just for the reflections, but really appreciate your perspective. Nahal, I mean, coming from more of the think tank perspective, right? It's not always that you hear think tanks talking about being in partnership and building power. So really, what does that look like in practice, and how do the priorities that you're putting forward really reflect that value?
Thank you. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I love being at Demos, is that we're a think tank that's orienting itself in collaboration with our movement partners, and that's really unusual. I think a lot of think tanks out there are pushing out the elitism that allows people to sit behind computers and come up with, at times, brilliant ideas. And so for me, overseeing our partnerships function and really digging into how are we investing in, building in, supporting, working alongside of, and elevating the thought leadership, particularly of Black and Brown organizers at this time, seems like exactly the right place to be. This idea that you can dream beyond precarity, right? And that you can actually think of a new world. The fact that we are accepting this idea of defunding the police, and we are thinking of new ways that our country and our society can be engineered, is something that's really fascinating to me. And it's also a symbol of all of the intersectional organizing that so many of social movements have been a part of and pushing themselves to be stronger around. And at Demos, one of the things that we're interested in is, how do people that are most impacted by the policies shape the actual design of these policies, right? How do we redistribute power in a way that's much more equitable, much more inclusive, much more accountable to us, the people whose lives are affected by these types of harms, when governments fail, when they take inaction, and when they, on the other side, as we know by the previous administration, take horrible actions against us. And so for us, it's not just an intellectual exercise. It's really a philosophy that we're trying to build out, in that we are investing in organizers, organizations that are community-based, grassroots partners, and pushing the national progressive sphere, which includes orgs like our own, to be much more bold, much more impactful, and dare dream of and usher in, alongside with our folks are on the ground and on the street, a new world. And thinking about what would it look like if people were debating about, I don't know, provisions around how much money you can get over the next couple of weeks that allowed you to not just survive, but actually live. What would it look like if our politicians came from our backgrounds, right? And had actually experienced economic insecurity or food insecurity, housing insecurity? What would it look like if the things that we dreamed of were designed by us, and we were the ones that designed the measures of impact? And so that's the philosophy behind Demos and some of the work that we're doing. But why actually the idea of partnering with social movements is so necessary and right for this moment.
Great, thank you. And one of the things you were just saying, I mean, in essence, it's reimagining the baseline of expectations, right? How do we not survive? How do all of us thrive? And what does that look like? And that is not necessarily the dominant view in the United States of the role of government to ensure that all of us thrives, right? That's highly contested. And so there are some questions in the Q&A that touch on our global human rights obligations, which we will get to in a moment. But I also just wanted to give Nadia a chance to either respond to the questions or to talk specifically about maybe an example or two of building power that aligns with the comments you were making, and really the reality that we are functioning within these systems of oppression in all our decision making.
Yeah, I mean, I want us to get to some of those questions because I think folks are raising, really critical, yeah, places where we need to pause and think and put our intellectual labor together. I mean, I think I'll just say that the way that both Mara and Nahal have spoken in terms of who are we not only partnering with, but whose leadership are we following in this is where human rights advocates have any legitimacy at all. Which is, who are you accountable to? Who are your people? And it's not, at CCR as a legal organization, we would say it's not that we're not accountable to the law. We're accountable to movement. We're accountable to people and their demands about the world that they need, and not the world that they concede to, not the world that the powerful are willing to offer crumbs to achieve. And it's what do our people need? And so following that leadership, which Nahal was talking around about self-determination, like what are people putting out, which is a key principle of human rights, that you define and you design the world and the structures that you need to survive, that allow you to live healthy, joyful, flourishing lives, right? That's the core of the self-determination piece. And what is our obligation? To protect the people's right to self-determine, to protect our community's right to design these structures, these alternative visions, and I'm thinking about in that sort of leadership you have, if you're listening to movement, those visions are there, right? Because it's the people who are closest to the systems and structures of oppression that have the innovation and the solutions necessary. So when you read something like the Breathe Act coming out of the Movement for Black Lives, you see an omnibus bill that encaptures what do we need in a society for Black people to live these joyful, flourishing lives. If you read the Red Deal coming out of the Red Nation, if you read, organizers out of Mi Gente and the immigrant rights movement, Detention Watch Network, you follow the leadership of those who are most impacted, the solutions are there. And the demands are there, so this concept of like, well, I hear you talking about transformational change, but what are your demands? The demands are there. So when CCR follows the leadership of our clients in Louisiana, who live in Death Alley, this area between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, highest percentage of petrochemical plants in the country, highest percentage of rates of respiratory illness and cancer rates. It used to be called Cancer Alley, is now renamed as Death Alley. If you listen, the demand is a moratorium on oil and gas. The demand is a fundamental restructuring of our society in favor of human flourishing and against extractive industry, against environmental degradation. If you listen to Indigenous people, you understand the world that we're trying to build and the demands and the road to get there. So the roadmaps are there, the vision is there, the dreams are there. It's the obstacles that you asked us to talk about too. It's like, what is the barrier of political will? And that's where you get anti-Black racism as a core of that. That's where you get sort of the capitalist infrastructure that Mara has been talking to us about. The will is obstructed because there are interests at play. There are interests at play for those in power to keep the status quo what it is. And our goal, I think, that we're all talking about is creating an alternative nexus of power that brings together those who are most impacted as a collective, as a mass movement, the biggest we that we can muster in order to create these transformative systems and structures that we need.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I know we have 9 minutes left. So I wanted to turn to a few of the questions. And one, I think, emerged partly in your response just now, Nadia, but the question is, how do we prioritize environmental justice while honoring the rights of children and of all people and all life on Earth? And I think, there is work that has already been mentioned around partnerships with Indigenous communities by several of the speakers. And in the sort of climate arena, we have been working also with folks in Louisiana and Alaska, where the tribes that we're talking to, they have climate adaptation plans. They have the knowledge, they have the ability to really ensure the environment and the people living there are protected and can grow. And it's about creating space for those ideas and funding and resources for those ideas to proliferate. And I think there's tons of examples from some of the global climate work as well. And we can maybe leave a moment for that. I also wanted to just respond to the questions that relate to the UN, both human rights treaties and the UN as a forum or rights protector. And there's really two separate questions, but maybe we can think about them together. One, it refers to the damage done to the redefinition of human rights by Secretary Pompeo. And for those of you that don't know, this was a project of the Trump administration, was to redefine global human rights norms to really prioritize religious liberty, a narrow reading of that, and the right to property. So one question is, how do we deal with the global and domestic fallout of that effort, which is, their website is already removed, but their ideas are out in the ether and have been supported by many governments. And the other question is around whether or not ratification of the Economic and Social Rights Covenant is a priority right now, and whether it should be. And I sort of mentioned at the top the ongoing failure of the US to recognize economic and social rights, things that all of you have spoken about: environment, clean water, housing, the things that we do need to thrive, and which have often been in the hands of the private market or heavily regulated by government, to be disproportionately available to white folks. So anyone want to, Nadia and I spend a lot of time talking about how the UN is also a space really of elitism, extreme privilege, and thinking about how to address that. But I want to give folks a chance to respond on the utility really in general of human rights treaties and human rights principles, and thinking about your work. So anyone want to lead with or start with that?
We deeply value many of the concepts, obviously, underlying the human rights treaties and the human rights principles, but like you, in terms of the UN, its operation, the UN has regularly been used, as we know, as a tool of US government's global ambitions. And similarly, any efforts at international forums for justice are very frequently used, manipulated also for, the US government's own imperialist goals. And so if there is a country or an entity that is being targeted by the US for whatever reasons, and of course we know that, the demonization is part and parcel of that type of targeting, and the US doesn't go to war against another country and say that it's doing it for other reasons, for its own global ambitions. It's always that there's some grand human rights scheme behind it, even though there is not. But that's what the US always says. And so this becomes deeply tied up into where these mechanisms become a tool for a US global aggressive agenda. And that's something I think we all have to really look at, very critically.
I'm happy to also provide an optimist frame, which maybe we all can use. So my formal background is in human rights, and so I still like approach the framework as an additive one, one that to me, despite elements of elitism, which I'm always happy to reject, actually is rooted in this like fundamental principle of self-determination, meaningful participation in the ideas and the policies that affect your lives, and access to decision making. I mean, these are things that are the words that underline the theories around economic and social rights, right? And I think a number of the principles around authoritarian regimes and indicators of repression, which we embodied in the US, quite frankly, in a really visible way in the last 4 years, but certainly weren't an anomaly given the undergirding of this country and how it was built. But I do still somewhat remain an optimist because of the fact that this frame can also be a real marker, right? Of kind of like the floor by which you must never go beneath in terms of standards of people's lives, the minimum things that you need to survive. And also, dare I say, dream too, and what you should strive towards. And so I think that's one reason why the framework and the quite frankly inexcusable responsibility that the United States has around the human rights regime is something that we can't ignore. I do believe Biden has a lot of work to do to undo a lot of the harms that have come back with a very, very messed up, very evangelical, very limited government, laissez-faire, authoritarian, white supremacist mentality that the previous administration or regime put forth. And I'll say also there was a question in the Q&A around the Economic and Social Rights Treaty, which is one of the treaties that's a core human rights treaty that the US has not ratified. Actually, the US has not ratified a bunch of treaties. We've done 3 or 4 if you count an optional protocol. And there's something there that we have to get to, which is this crazy idea that somehow there's this dichotomy between civil rights and political rights and participation and economic and social rights. So if we preserve one on paper for some people in this country, we don't need to worry about the other. And I kind of reject this idea that these are spheres of people's lives that are not actually interlinked. Anybody who's had been forced to interact with the criminal justice system, right? You might not have secure housing as a result. You also might not be able to vote. And so that's why for Demos, we purposely look at these. These are the orbits of power that we are trying to reorient and reframe and grab and make our own. But I also think it's something for all of us as advocates for justice. We need to be on the same mentality as our partners on the ground, if we're not those people in the street ourselves, in that we are seeing all these struggles as interlinked. And so a failure to ratify a particular treaty is an indictment on our reality and the values that we hold. And it's inexcusable. And it's up to someone like Biden and the Congress right now to think of not teeing up against each other these fights as if fights for justice replace one another, and actually going about them in a systematic, bold way.
Okay, Nadia, last minute to you.
I was texting that you should just close us out, but
Oh, yeah, my multitasking skills.
No, it's great. I think that my colleagues and comrades just closed us out too. I mean, the U.S. it's not about restoring or simply restoring or returning to obligations that were undone by the Trump administration. And it goes back to how we started this conversation. It really is a fundamental reimagining and reconfiguring about our role in the global community. And I think going to what Mara was saying, the sort of self-reflection and accountability that is necessary for the US to authentically engage in the global community is critical, because the double standards that have undermined the human rights framework are bolstered by the US, are promoted by the US and the US's engagement and kind of posture of domination in the global community and global space, economic, political order. And so what it does actually is that it points to the work that all of us have to do when we're engaging in social change, which is to self-reflect, the principle of reflexivity, where you look at how you are complicit in systems and structures of harm. What are you benefiting from? What needs to be relinquished of your own power in order to ensure that all people can live free, in order that we can achieve collective liberation? It's really about self-acknowledgement and accountability, which are also principles of human rights and international law that get us to a place where we can kind of restructure a world order that is more free, that is more just.
And I think the last thing I'll just say, because this is targeting a law school audience, I think there has been a longstanding divide between human rights lawyers fancying themselves as domestic human rights lawyers and sometimes civil rights lawyers being one and the same, and folks looking at foreign policy. And those divides and focusing in those orbits has allowed some real harm in both circles, and really needing to hold the US accountable to what it's saying in all of these spaces, foreign policy and domestic policy, and to assure those priorities are aligned, because historically they have not been, and that's where it's the people that need to be rising up and are. And so thinking about how as lawyers we can support that. So thank you so much, Nadia, Nahal, Mara, and Jessica, who's there behind our poster, and Vince as well. And thank you, participants, for your questions and for staying with us. I learned a lot as always. So be well and stay safe. Take care.